The winter of 1888 came down on the Grey Valley like a hammer. It was not a gentle arrival, not a slow dusting of snow that promised cozy nights by the fire. It was a physical blow, an Arctic fist that struck in late October and did not relent. The wind came first, a fief that stole the breath from your lungs and the heat from beneath your door. It scoured the hard, frozen earth and whistled a tune of pure malice through the chinks in every log cabin. The cold that followed was a different beast entirely. It was a presence, a weight. It did not knock before it entered. It seeped through the thickest walls, settled deep into the bones, and made a mockery of the frantic, hungry fires that colonists fed with precious, fast-burning poplar and pine. This was a place built on pride and pine logs, a settlement carved from a wilderness that gave little and took much. The people here were hard, practical folk who believed in the visible, the tangible, the height of a woodpile, the thickness of a wall, the sharpness of an axe. Their methods were inherited, passed down from father to son, a catechism of survival that had worked, just barely, for 2 generations. They built their cabins square. They stuffed the gaps with moss and mud. They cut wood all autumn, racing the first frost, and spent the winter feeding the insatiable iron stoves that glowed red in the center of their homes but could not push the chill from the corners. The struggle was universal. In the cabin of the blacksmith, his wife rocked a feverish child, her own breath pluming in the air just feet from the stove. She fed the fire with a kind of desperate rhythm, knowing each log bought them only another hour of fragile warmth. The settlement's most respected builder, a broad-shouldered man named Thomas, had a woodpile that was the envy of all, a fortress of split logs that stood taller than he did. Yet even he felt the cold like a knife at his family's back. He watched the wood diminish with an anxious, calculating eye. His cabin, built with his own expert hands, was still a sieve against the onslaught. Frost painted delicate, cruel ferns on the inside of his window panes and crept like a living thing across the floorboards. The cold was a great equalizer, humbling the proud and terrifying the weak. It was a siege, and every cabin was a fortress under assault, and every fortress was failing. They were all losing the war, log by precious log. They clung to their traditions, to the methods they knew, because in a place this unforgiving, the unknown was a greater terror than the familiar hardship. They believed in wood, they believed in fire, And they believed the vast, sullen marsh at the edge of the valley was nothing but useless, treacherous ground, a place of sucking mud in the summer and frozen reeds in the winter. It was a blank spot on their map of resources, a void they simply farmed around and ignored. Into this world of rigid belief and shared desperation lived Elara. She was a widow, a quiet woman who had arrived with her husband 3 years prior from a land across the ocean, a place of green hills and constant rain they spoke of with a soft, strange accent. Her husband, a man as quiet as she, had built their cabin in the same square shape as all the others before a summer fever took him, leaving Elara with little more than a small garden plot and a home that was just as vulnerable as everyone else's. The community pitied her. They saw her as a fragile bird, a woman alone with no man to swing an axe, no son to haul the wood. They expected the winter would break her. They would cluck their tongues and say it was a sad thing, but not an unexpected one. But Elara carried a different kind of knowledge, a memory of a different kind of warmth. She remembered the hearths of her childhood, fires that did not roar and consume, but glowed with a deep, abiding heat. They were fed not with wood, but with the earth itself. She looked at the useless, despised marsh, and she saw not a wasteland, but a treasure house. She saw the brown gold that her grandmothers had cut and dried for centuries. She saw peat. While her neighbors were sharpening their axes and heading for the thinning woods, Elara took up her husband's spade and walked toward the marsh. The first time they saw her out there, sinking to her ankles in the cold mire, they thought she had gone mad with grief. She was not gathering reeds or trapping muskrats. She was digging. She worked with a strange, rhythmic motion, slicing into the dark, wet earth and pulling up thick, rectangular blocks of what looked to them like nothing more than mud. She heaved the heavy bricks onto a small handcart, her small frame straining with the effort, and hauled them back to her cabin, leaving a trail of dark, wet clumps behind her. The sight was so peculiar it became the talk of the settlement. Men paused on their way to the forest to watch her, leaning on their axes with expressions of pure bewilderment. Women whispered from their doorways, shaking their heads. Thomas, the builder, was the first to approach her. He was not a cruel man, but he was a man who believed in the solid truth of his own experience. He saw her work as a dangerous delusion, a waste of the last precious days of autumn. "Elara," he said, his voice laced with a gruff sort of concern, "what are you doing? There's no time for this." He gestured at the cart of wet sod, his meaning clear. "I am preparing for winter, Thomas," she answered simply, not pausing in her work. Her face was smudged with black earth, her hands raw. He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "With mud? Woman, you cannot burn mud. You will fill your cabin with smoke and foul air. You will choke to death long before you freeze." He was trying to help, to impart the wisdom of the valley. "There is still some fallen wood at the edge of the woods. It is not much, but it is better than this folly." "This is not folly," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "and it is not mud." Her certainty only solidified their ridicule. The story of her strange labor spread, and with it the laughter. They called it Elara's folly. Children would sometimes creep to the edge of the marsh to watch the mad widow digging in the bog. Men would joke about it over their evening meals. "Heard Elara is building a new cabin," one might say, "out of mud bricks. Plans to heat it by staring at them very hard." The laughter that followed was easy and self-assured, the laughter of people who know they are right. They saw her not as an innovator, but as a cautionary tale, a mind unhinged by sorrow and solitude. Their mockery was a wall they built between her and them, a reinforcement of their own shared and failing wisdom. Elara heard the whispers. She saw the pointed fingers and the shaking heads, but she did not stop. The scorn of her neighbors was a distant noise, faded and unimportant next to the urgent memory of the coming cold and the deep ancestral knowledge that guided her hands. She worked alone, a solitary figure against the vast gray sky, digging her winter warmth from the cold, wet earth. Each swing of the spade was an act of faith. Each brick she cut was a prayer against the ice. She knew what they did not. She knew that the earth held its own fire, and she was patiently, painstakingly, bringing it to the surface. She worked with a diligence that bordered on obsession. From the first light of dawn until the sky began to purple with dusk, Elara was in the marsh or beside her cabin, tending to her harvest. The work was a slow, arduous ballet of labor. First came the cutting. She had modified her husband's garden spade, attaching a longer handle and a small angled flange to one side, creating a crude version of the tool she remembered from her childhood, a slane. With it, she could slice cleanly into the compressed layers of ancient vegetation, cutting uniform bricks about the size of a loaf of bread. The physical effort was immense. The wet peat was heavy, dense with water, and pulling each brick from the sucking grip of the bog required all her strength. Her back ached with a fire of its own, and her hands, unused to such relentless toil, became a geography of blisters and calluses. Yet she did not falter. She loaded the wet bricks onto the small cart, its wooden wheels sinking into the soft ground, and hauled her load back to the clearing beside her cabin. The journey was only a few hundred yards, but with each load weighing more than she did, it was a monumental trek she repeated dozens of times a day. Back at the cabin, the second stage of her work began, the drying. This was the part that required not just strength, but a precise and patient science. She did not simply dump the bricks in a pile. She stacked them carefully, creating small, hollow pyramids, leaning them against one another so that the ever-present wind could flow through the gaps. She knew that the wind was her ally, the same wind that would later become her enemy. It was a thirsty wind, and it would drink the water from the peat, transforming the heavy, useless mud into light, combustible fuel. Day after day, her collection of strange, dark structures grew. Rows of them standing like a miniature city of sod, smelling of damp earth and something ancient, something wild. While Elara engaged in her slow, methodical labor, the rest of the Grey Valley was a hive of frantic activity. The thud of axes echoed from the woods, a percussive soundtrack to their anxiety. Thomas and the other men worked with a grim urgency, felling the last of the suitable trees, their muscles straining as they chopped and split the logs. They were racing against the inevitable arrival of the snow that would make the forest impassable. Their work was one of subtraction, of taking from a dwindling resource. They piled the wood high against their cabins, the stacks a public measure of their foresight and industry. A man with a tall woodpile was a good husband, a responsible provider. A man with a short one was a fool. They saw Elara's strange, patient work and saw only idleness, a squandering of precious time. "She will be begging for firewood come December," one man grumbled to another, wiping sweat from his brow as he split a stubborn log. "And whose pile will she come knocking at?" the other man grunted in agreement. It was a common sentiment. They saw her lack of a woodpile not as a sign of a different strategy, but as a clear sign of impending failure. Her isolation was complete. She worked in a bubble of their collective disbelief, her quiet diligence a stark contrast to their loud, desperate preparations. The innovation was in the material itself and in the understanding of its properties. The men of the valley saw mud. Elara saw compressed time, a fuel made from centuries of fallen grasses and mosses, packed down and preserved in the oxygen-starved environment of the bog. She understood the alchemy of its transformation. The dark, wet bricks, heavy as stone, would lose more than 3/4 of their weight as they dried. The water would evaporate, leaving behind a porous, fibrous block of pure carbon. She explained this to no one, because no one asked. They did not see the science, they saw only the madness. They did not understand that the slow, smoldering burn of peat released its energy over hours, not minutes. A single brick would outlast 5 logs of poplar. They did not comprehend the concept of radiant heat, the deep, penetrating warmth that a dense fuel source created, a warmth that soaked into the very walls of a cabin rather than fleeting up a chimney. Her knowledge was a foreign language in a land that only spoke the dialect of wood. And so she worked on, her silence mistaken for ignorance, her patient labor seen as a fool's errand, while the cold breath of the coming winter gathered its strength on the northern horizon. The storm arrived without preamble. One afternoon the gray sky turned a bruised, malevolent purple, and the wind, which had been a constant companion, began to howl like a wounded animal. Then the snow began. It was not the gentle, picturesque snow of storybooks. It was a horizontal blizzard, a blinding wall of white fury that erased the world. It came down not in flakes, but in tiny, hard pellets of ice that stung any exposed skin and rattled against the log walls like thrown gravel. The people of the Grey Valley shuttered their windows, barred their doors, and huddled closer to their stoves. They had seen blizzards before. They thought they were prepared. They were wrong. This was not a blizzard. It was a siege. The temperature plummeted to a depth none of them had ever experienced, a cold so profound it felt like the world itself was dying. The wind was a solid force, a battering ram that shook the cabins to their foundations and found every tiny, invisible crack to exploit. It drove the snow into drifts that buried fences, then windows, then climbed with predatory slowness up the walls of the cabins themselves, entombing the families within. The storm did not last for a day or two. It raged for a week, a relentless, shrieking assault that broke the spirit as surely as it chilled the bone. Inside the cabins, the familiar battle for warmth became a desperate, losing war. The woodpiles, which had seemed so monumental in the autumn sun, vanished with terrifying speed. The fast-burning pine and poplar logs turned to ash in an hour, their heat a fleeting comfort that was immediately devoured by the monstrous cold. Thomas, the master builder, the man with the largest woodpile, felt a cold knot of fear tighten in his stomach. He fed his stove constantly, but the cabin remained dangerously cold. His children, wrapped in every blanket they owned, shivered uncontrollably. The frost no longer stayed on the windows. It climbed the walls, a crystalline tide that marked the advance of the enemy. Drafts that had once been minor annoyances now cut through the room like invisible razors. The community began to fail. From one cabin, a man emerged, his face a mask of desperation, and began to hack apart his own fence for firewood. In another, a family burned a chair, then a small table, the polished wood of their meager belongings sacrificed for a few more precious hours of heat. The sound of coughing carried on the wind from house to house, a grim chorus of the cold's victory. The methods that had sustained them for generations were breaking. Their reliance on wood, on the quick, hot fire, was proving to be a fatal flaw in the face of such an overwhelming adversary. Their fortress walls were cracking. Their pride was freezing. But in Elara's small cabin, buried just as deeply in the snow, the story was different. The wind howled outside her walls. The snow pressed against her door. But inside, there was a quiet, steady calm. The air was not hot, but it was warm, an even and consistent heat that filled the single room from corner to corner. There was no desperate, frantic feeding of the fire. On her stone hearth, a small pile of dark brown bricks glowed with a deep, cherry-red intensity. They did not flame or roar. They smoldered, releasing their energy with a miserly, enduring patience. The peat bricks were performing exactly as she knew they would. Their dense, compressed nature meant they burned for hours, radiating a profound warmth that soaked into the very logs of her cabin, turning the structure itself into a thermal mass that held the heat. The wind could not steal this warmth. The cold could not penetrate it. She had a neat, dry stack of the bricks beside her hearth, a small mountain of fuel that would last her for weeks. She sat in her rocking chair, mending a sock. The only sounds, the rhythmic click of her knitting needles, and the whisper of the wind outside. A beast she had tamed, a monster held at bay. Her cabin was not a fortress under siege. It was an island of warmth in a sea of ice, a testament to a wisdom her neighbors had scorned. The test had come, and her folly was proving to be the only true salvation. The contrast was as stark as the frozen landscape outside. In Thomas's cabin, desperation had set in. His mighty woodpile was gone, reduced to a pathetic mound of splinters and bark. For the last 2 days, he had been burning the green, unseasoned logs he had set aside for the following year. A foul-smelling, smoky fire that gave off more frustration than heat. The interior temperature of his home hovered just above freezing. His wife huddled with their 2 small children under a mountain of quilts on the bed, their faces pale, their breath visible in the frigid air. Every hour, Thomas would open the stove, and the blast of cold air that rushed in would make them all flinch. He was failing them. The knowledge and strength he had prided himself on were useless. Meanwhile, inside Elara's cabin, the temperature was a comfortable 60 degrees. She moved about the room in a simple woolen shawl, not bundled in layers of frantic insulation. Her fuel consumption was a quiet miracle of efficiency. Every 4 or 5 hours, she would place a single, dry peat brick onto the glowing embers of the last. There was no roar, no sudden burst of flame, just a continuation of the steady, silent heat. Her small store of bricks seemed almost untouched. She was not merely surviving the storm, she was living through it, her environment one of calm and stability. While her neighbors were fighting for their lives, she was simply waiting for the weather to pass. The breaking point for Thomas came on the 8th night of the storm. The last of his green wood was gone. He had burned a broken stool and 2 spare axe handles. The fire in his stove dwindled to a few angry red coals, and the cold, which had been held at the edges of the room, now flooded in, claiming the space with a palpable, predatory chill. His youngest daughter began to cry, a thin, weak sound that cut him deeper than any shard of ice. He looked at his wife's terrified face, and his pride finally shattered. There was only one place left to turn, one last, humiliating hope. He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and forced his door open against the immense pressure of the snowdrift. He plunged into a world of white chaos. The wind tore at him, and the snow was so deep it was like wading through frozen sand. He fought his way across the short distance to Elara's cabin, the place of Elara's folly, the home of the mad widow he had pitied and mocked. He expected to find it dark and cold, its inhabitant frozen, a tragic confirmation of his own superior wisdom. He stumbled to her door and knocked, his fist numb, the sound swallowed by the storm. The door opened. A wave of soft, steady warmth washed over him, so profound and unexpected it felt like a physical blow. It was not the scorching, dry heat of a wood stove, but a gentle, humid warmth that smelled faintly of damp earth and moss. He stared, speechless. Elara stood there, holding a small lamp, her face calm. Behind her, he could see the impossible, a small, cozy room glowing in the lamplight. He saw the neat stack of dark bricks by the hearth, and the slow, incandescent fire that seemed to burn without flame. He looked from the fire to her face, his own expression a mixture of disbelief, shame, and desperate hope. He was wrong. It was the most profound and terrifying realization of his life. He had been so sure, so arrogant, and so utterly, devastatingly wrong. Elara did not gloat. She did not say, "I told you so." She saw the desperation etched on his face, the rime of ice in his beard, the defeat in his eyes. Her expression was one of simple, quiet compassion. "Come in, Thomas," she said, her voice soft but clear over the howl of the wind. "You will catch your death out there." She stepped back, holding the door open. He stumbled inside, bringing a swirl of snow and frigid air with him, and she quickly shut the door, sealing them back inside the cocoon of warmth. She gestured to a small wooden chair near the hearth. "Sit," she said. "I will make you some tea." Her triumph was not in words, but in the quiet, undeniable fact of the gentle heat that was already beginning to thaw his frozen spirit. Thomas sat, his large frame trembling, as much from shock as from cold. He held his numb hands out to the hearth, feeling the deep, radiant heat soak into his stiff fingers. It was unlike any fire he had ever known. It was a living warmth, a presence in the room. He watched as Elara took 2 of the dark bricks and placed them carefully on the glowing embers. There was no smoke, no fuss, just a slow intensification of the red glow. He had come to her door expecting to find a victim of the storm. Instead, he had found its master. He finally found his voice, a raw, broken whisper. "My wood. It is all gone. My children are freezing." Elara simply nodded. She went to the neat stack of peat bricks, gathered a heavy armful, and wrapped them in a piece of burlap. "Take these," she said, holding the bundle out to him. "They will last you through the night. Put 2 on the coals at a time. Do not let them flame." He took the bundle, the bricks surprisingly light for their size. He looked at her, the shame and gratitude warring on his face. I laughed at you," he stammered. "We all did." "The winter does not care about laughter," she replied, her voice devoid of accusation. "It only cares if you are warm." Her quiet dignity was more humbling than any rebuke. He had come to her as a skeptic, a man of superior knowledge. He would leave as a believer, carrying the very fuel he had derided as mud, his only hope for his family's survival. When Thomas returned to his cabin, the change was immediate and profound. He placed the peat bricks on the dying embers of his fire, and just as Elara had said, they began to glow, slowly pushing back the oppressive cold. A steady, resilient warmth began to fill the room, a heat that felt as if it had substance and weight. His wife and children, huddled under their blankets, felt the shift. The shivering subsided. A fragile sense of hope returned to the frigid little cabin. Thomas sat by the stove all night, watching the mud burn, a silent vigil of awe and repentance. The next morning, with the storm still raging, he told his closest neighbor, a man named Samuel, whose family was also suffering. Samuel, desperate, followed Thomas back to Elara's cabin. He, too, entered the bubble of impossible warmth, stared in disbelief, and left with an armful of peat and a humbled spirit. The news began to spread, a current of astonishing truth traveling through the snowbound settlement. One by one, then in pairs, the men of the valley made the pilgrimage to the widow's door. They came not to mock, but to witness a miracle. Each man had the same reaction, a moment of stunned silence at the door as the warmth hit him, followed by a slow, dawning realization as he saw the glowing hearth. The laughter of the autumn was replaced by the quiet respect of the winter. Thomas was the first to return for a second time, not for more fuel, but for knowledge. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a world of profound silence and monumental snowdrifts. He found Elara outside, calmly clearing a path from her door. He stood before her, his hat in his hands, his usual bluster gone, replaced by a deep and genuine humility. "Elara," he began, his voice heavy with sincerity, "you saved my family. You have saved all of us." He paused, gathering his courage. "I was a fool, a proud, blind fool." He looked from her face to the endless white landscape, then back. "When the thaw comes," he said, the words a solemn vow, "teach me. Teach me how you do this. I want to learn." This was the moment of true victory. Not the survival, not the vindication, but this, the proudest man in the valley asking for her wisdom. The master builder becoming the student. It was the symbolic surrender of an entire community's failed tradition. Elara looked at him, and for the first time, a small, gentle smile touched her lips. She held no grudges. She saw not the man who had mocked her, but a neighbor who had seen the truth and was brave enough to admit it. She saw a father who loved his children. "Of course, Thomas," she said, "I will teach you. I will teach anyone who wishes to learn." She shared her knowledge as freely as she had shared her fuel. She held nothing back. To the men who crowded into her small, warm cabin over the following days, she explained the entire process. She described the specific feel of the best peat, rich and dark, not too woody. She drew the shape of the slain in the ash on her hearth, explaining how the side wing cut the brick free. She detailed the critical importance of the drying, the way the wind had to pass through the stacks, the patience it required. She answered every question without judgment, her voice calm and steady. She was not a savior bestowing a gift. She was a teacher passing on a legacy, a practical inheritance of survival from her ancestors to her new community. They listened, rapt and ashamed of their earlier ignorance, as the quiet widow they had dismissed as mad revealed the simple, profound wisdom of the earth. When the great thaw finally came, and the gray valley emerged, blinking, into the spring sun, the landscape began to change. The first green shoots pushing through the mud were accompanied by a new kind of activity. Led by Thomas, the men of the settlement did not head for the woods with their axes. Instead, they walked to the marsh, their boots sinking into the soft, waking earth. The blacksmith had spent the last weeks of winter forging new tools, not axes or plowshares, but slains, their long handles and angled blades built to Elara's precise specifications. Elara stood with them at the edge of the bog, no longer an outcast, but a revered instructor. She showed them how to find the best ground, how to read the layers in the earth. She demonstrated the cutting technique again, the smooth, practiced motion of slicing and lifting. The men, including the once skeptical Thomas, followed her lead. At first, their movements were clumsy, their bricks misshapen. But they learned. They worked together, a community united in a new purpose. The air, which in previous springs had echoed with the sound of splitting wood, was now filled with the squelch of spades in wet earth and the quiet camaraderie of shared labor. All through the summer, the clearings around the cabins were dotted with the strange, dark pyramids of drying peat. The earthy, slightly smoky smell of it became the new scent of the valley, the fragrance of security and foresight. Children who had once mocked Elara now played games among the drying stacks. The women learned to gauge the dryness of a brick by its weight and feel. New sheds were built, low and long, designed specifically to store the winter's supply of brown gold. The tall, proud woodpiles that had once been the symbol of preparedness were now seen for what they were, an inefficient, laborious relic of a harder time. The physical landscape of the settlement was remade by the new knowledge. The story of the Gray Valley's transformation traveled. Traders who passed through the following winter were astonished by the change. They expected to find a community chastened and diminished by the legendary White Winter of '88. Instead, they found a place of unprecedented comfort and confidence. They sat in cabins that were evenly, deeply warm, and they saw the strange brown bricks burning slowly in the stoves. They asked questions, and the settlers, with a humility born of hard experience, told them the story of the quiet widow and her folly. The tale spread to other settlements on the frontier, to other communities facing the same struggles with brutal winters and scarce timber. The idea, so simple and yet so revolutionary, was carried in letters and by word of mouth. The knowledge that Elara had shared so freely began to take root in other valleys, on other prairies. Her quiet innovation became a silent, creeping movement, a change that happened not by decree, but by the simple, powerful proof of a warm home in the dead of winter. Years later, the Gray Valley was a different place. The winters still came down like a hammer, but they were no longer a source of terror. They were simply a season to be weathered, a time of rest and security. Elara was now an old woman, her hair the color of dried peat ash. She was no longer the strange outsider, but the respected heart of the community, a living reminder of their most important lesson. Children would bring her gifts from their gardens, and the men would still consult her on the quality of the peat from a new section of the marsh. The final, enduring lesson was not about fuel, but about wisdom. The people of the valley learned that the greatest resources are often hidden in plain sight, dismissed as worthless by the proud and the ignorant. they discovered that true strength was not in clinging to flawed traditions, but in the humility to learn from an unexpected source. The harshest winter had taught them that wisdom does not always carry an axe or speak with a loud, confident voice. Sometimes it is quiet, patient, and carries a spade. It comes from the earth itself, if you are only humble enough to listen. And as the smoke curled from every chimney in the valley, a uniform signal of shared warmth and security, it stood as a testament not just to the fire from the ground, but to the quiet, resilient woman who had taught them all how to find it.